What if a piece of paper, a visa stamped with dreams, was ripped to shreds by the very person paid to protect your journey? For 17-year-old Seraphina Washington, a trip to London for a prestigious music audition became a nightmare at the hands of a TSA officer. But this wasn't just a torn document. It was a shattered future. Little did Officer Miller know his act of casual cruelty would ignite a firestorm, reaching the highest levels of aviation oversight. This isn't just a story of injustice. It's a story of how one young woman's courage and a single phone call brought down a system of abuse and ended careers. Stay with us as we unravel the shocking, real-life drama of how karma delivered its most brutal lesson. The air in the sterile, white-walled Transportation Security Administration screening area at JFK International Airport was thick with the usual cocktail of anxiety and impatience. For Seraphina Washington, however, a different feeling bubbled beneath the surface, a nervous, fluttering excitement. At 17, she was on the cusp of the biggest moment of her life. Tucked securely in her violin case, a rare 18th-century Galliano, was a letter of invitation from the Royal Academy of Music in London. This wasn't just an audition. It was a key to a future she had spent her entire life working for. Her fingers, long and calloused from years of practice, tapped a silent Vivaldi concerto against the worn leather of the case. She'd aced the online portfolio submission and the preliminary video interviews. This final in-person audition was the last hurdle. Her student visa, a pristine document she had painstakingly applied for and received, was nestled in her passport, a tangible symbol of her dreams. Next. The voice was sharp, laced with a weary authority that brooked no argument. Seraphina moved forward, her bright, optimistic smile a stark contrast to the grim expressions of the travelers around her. She placed her carry-on, her violin case, and her small personal bag into the grey plastic bins, her movements fluid and practiced. She'd flown before, though never internationally on her own. Her mother, a single parent who worked double shifts as a nurse to fund Seraphina's passion, had wanted to be here, but the cost of another ticket was prohibitive. "You're a strong, independent woman, Sarah," she'd said, her voice thick with pride and unshed tears during their early morning video call. "Go make your magic." The man who had barked next was Officer Miller. He was a man of medium height and build, with a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. His eyes, the color of dishwater, swept over Seraphina with a dismissive glance. He was what his colleagues charitably called old school, a term that often excused a multitude of sins from casual rudeness to outright prejudice. Miller believed he had a sixth sense for trouble, a gut feeling that had in his mind been honed by years of service. In reality, it was a finely tuned set of biases that he allowed to guide his professional conduct. Seraphina stepped through the full-body scanner without incident. As she waited for her belongings to emerge from the X-ray tunnel, she saw them stop. Officer Miller had his hand on the conveyor belt's control. His eyes narrowed at the screen. He said something to a younger female officer beside him, who simply shrugged. "Whose violin is this?" Miller's voice boomed across the checkpoint. "It's mine, sir," Seraphina said, her voice clear and respectful. She stepped forward. "Anything in here I should know about?" he asked, his tone accusatory. He tapped the image on the screen, a dense, dark shape within the case. "No, sir. It's just my violin and its accessories. It's an antique." She hoped the information would convey its value and the need for careful handling. Miller grunted. He pulled the violin case from the line and carried it to a separate stainless steel table for a secondary inspection. Seraphina's heart began a frantic staccato against her ribs. She'd read the horror stories online, priceless instruments damaged by careless TSA agents. "I need to open it," he stated, not asked. "Of course," Seraphina said, her voice a little tighter now. "Please be careful. It's very old." Miller's lip curled into a sneer. "I know how to do my job, missy." He fumbled with the latches, his thick fingers clumsy and impatient. Seraphina bit her lip to keep from crying out. Finally, the case sprang open. The deep, rich wood of the Gagliano gleamed under the harsh, fluorescent lights. Miller poked at the rosin, the shoulder rest, and the spare strings. He ran his gloved fingers around the velvet lining. Finding nothing, his frustration seemed to grow. It was as if he was personally offended that his suspicion had been unfounded. His eyes then fell on the document pouch inside the case's lid. "What's this?" he demanded, pulling out her passport and the attached visa. "That's my passport and my student visa for the UK, sir," Seraphina explained. He opened the passport, his gaze lingering on her photo. He flicked through the pages, then pulled out the visa, a single sheet of paper filled with official stamps and her personal details. He held it up to the light, examining it with an exaggerated scrutiny. "This doesn't look right," he declared, his voice loud enough for those nearby to turn and watch. A cold dread washed over Seraphina. I don't understand. It was issued by the British consulate last month. All the paperwork is in order." "Doesn't look right to me," he repeated, tapping the paper with a thick finger. "The font on this Washington looks a little off, a little too bold." "But that's how they printed it," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I can show you the confirmation emails, the acceptance letter from the school." "Anyone can fake an email," Miller scoffed. He held the visa in one hand and her passport in the other, comparing them with a theatrical frown. The queue behind Seraphina was growing longer, the collective impatience of the travelers now directed at her. She felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and fear. "Sir, I assure you it's real. My audition is tomorrow morning. I can't miss this flight." The plea in her voice was raw. Miller seemed to enjoy her distress. A small, cruel smile played on his lips. "You know, we've been having a lot of problems with fraudulent documents lately, especially from, well, you know." He let the sentence hang in the air, thick with insinuation. He didn't need to say the words. The way his eyes swept over her dark skin and the box braids that framed her face said it all. Seraphina felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't about a font. This was about her. "There is nothing wrong with my visa," she said, her voice gaining a steely edge, despite the terror clawing at her throat. "I'll be the judge of that," Miller said. And then, with a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness, he took the visa in both hands. He looked directly into her eyes, a glint of malicious satisfaction in his own. And he ripped it in half. The sound was shockingly loud in the tense silence that had fallen over the checkpoint. The two pieces of paper fluttered from his hands onto the cold, sterile floor. Seraphina stared at the torn document, her mind refusing to process what had just happened. Her future, her dreams, her mother's sacrifices all lay in two useless scraps at the feet of this man. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. "That's a fraudulent document," Miller announced to the silent onlookers, his voice booming with self-importance. "This young lady isn't going anywhere." Tears welled in Seraphina's eyes, hot and furious. But through the blur, she saw something else in Officer Miller's face, a look of absolute power of a man who believed he was untouchable. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but it was joined by a cold, hard resolve. He had picked the wrong girl. The initial shock was a physical blow knocking the air from her lungs. For a few seconds, the world narrowed to the two torn pieces of her future lying on the speckled linoleum floor. The ambient noise of the airport, the rolling of suitcases, the muffled announcements, the low hum of conversations, faded into a distant roar. All Seraphina could hear was the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart. Officer Miller stood over the tattered visa. His arms crossed, a smug sentinel guarding a gate she could no longer pass through. He had dismissed her, turned his attention to the next passenger, leaving her in a self-contained bubble of crisis. "Ma'am, you need to collect your belongings and step aside. You're holding up the line." It was the younger female officer, her tone not unkind, but firm. She avoided looking at Seraphina's face, her gaze fixed on the plastic bins. Seraphina knelt, her movements stiff and robotic, and picked up the two pieces of paper. The clean, sharp tear felt like a wound in her own skin. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold them. She looked up at Miller, who was now brusquely handling an elderly couple's luggage. He was already moving on his act of casual destruction, a mere footnote in his shift. For him, it was over. For her, the world had just ended. Tears streamed down her face, now hot and silent. She wanted to scream, to rage, to demand his name, his badge number, to tell everyone what he had done. But her throat was tight with unshed sobs, and the stares of the other passengers felt like physical blows. They saw a problem, a delay, a young black girl causing a scene. They didn't see the years of 6 a.m. practice sessions, the scraped fingers, the missed parties, the single-minded dedication. They didn't see her mother's exhausted but proud face. She numbly gathered her things, her hands fumbling with the violin case. The instrument inside, once a source of immense pride, now felt like a lead weight. What was the point of it now? She was directed to a small, soulless waiting area to the side of the main checkpoint, a purgatory for those with travel problems. It was furnished with hard plastic chairs and a water-stained table. She sat down, the torn visa still clutched in her hand, and finally let the sobs come. They were ragged, desperate sounds torn from the very core of her being. She pulled out her phone, her fingers slipping on the screen. Her first instinct was to call her mom. But what would she say? "Hi, Mom. Everything we worked for, everything you sacrificed for, is gone." A man tore it up because he didn't like the font. The thought of the devastation in her mother's voice was more than she could bear. No, not yet. Crying wouldn't fix this. Giving up wasn't an option. Her mother hadn't raised a quitter. Wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, a new, unfamiliar emotion began to solidify from the molten mess of her grief-cold, diamond-hard anger. This wasn't just unfair. It was a violation. It was an abuse of power, fueled by a prejudice so casual, it was breathtaking. Officer Miller hadn't just torn a document. He had tried to tear away her identity as a scholar, an artist, a person worthy of respect. He had tried to reduce her to a stereotype. She looked at the two pieces of paper in her hand. Evidence. She took a deep breath, forcing her trembling to subside. "Think, Seraphina. Think like a chess player," her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "Don't just see the move in front of you. See 3 moves ahead." Her first move was documentation. She used her phone to take a high-resolution photo of the torn visa, making sure the rip was clearly visible. She then took a picture of it next to her passport for context. She angled her phone and, trying to be discreet, took a photo of Officer Miller, who was still pontificating at the secondary screening table. His name tag was clearly visible, R. Miller. She zoomed in. The image was a little blurry, but the name was legible. Next, she needed a witness. Her eyes scanned the waiting area. Most people were engrossed in their phones or staring blankly ahead. But then she saw him, a man in his late 40s wearing a tweed jacket that looked too warm for the airport. He had been in the line directly behind her. He'd seen the whole thing. He was now looking at her with an expression of sympathy and discomfort. Seraphina stood up and walked over to him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice still shaky but firm. "You were behind me in the security line just now. You saw what that officer did." The man looked startled to be addressed. He glanced nervously towards the TSA checkpoint. "Look, I don't want to get involved." "I'm not asking you to get involved right now," Seraphina said, her voice pleading but also insistent. "He tore up my visa. I'm going to miss my audition for the Royal Academy of Music in London. This is my entire future. All I'm asking is for your name and number, just in case. So I'm not the only one who saw it." The man hesitated. He looked at her face at the tear tracks, still glistening on her cheeks, at the fierce determination in her eyes. He sighed, a look of weary resignation on his face. "It was a rotten thing to do," he said quietly. He pulled a business card from his wallet. "David Chen. I'm a professor of history at Columbia." He handed her the card. "I can't promise I'll be much help, but you can call me." "Thank you," Seraphina breathed, clutching the card like a lifeline. "Thank you so much." She returned to her seat, her mind racing. An idea audacious and terrifying was beginning to form. Going to the airline desk would be useless. Without a valid visa, they couldn't let her board. Complaining to Miller's supervisor would likely result in a bureaucratic runaround, a classic case of the fox guarding the henhouse. They would close ranks. No. She had to go higher. Much higher. She remembered a segment she'd seen on the news a few months ago. It was about a whistleblower who had exposed safety concerns at a major airline. The report had mentioned the governing body that oversees aviation in the United States. She couldn't remember the exact name. She pulled out her phone and started searching. US Aviation Oversight. Who polices the TSA? Government Agency for Airport Security Complaints. The search results were a confusing mix of acronyms, FAA, DHS, TSA itself. But then a name caught her eye, the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, and specifically its Subcommittee on Aviation. The website described its role in overseeing all aspects of civil aviation, including security. It was a long shot, a ridiculously long shot. A 17-year-old girl calling a powerful Congressional committee. It was insane. But what other choice did she have? Her dream was already in pieces on the floor. What more could she lose? She found the main number for the committee. Her finger hovered over the call button. Her fear was a roaring tide, but her anger was the seawall holding it back. She thought of Officer Miller's sneer. She thought of the years of sacrifice. She pressed the button. A polite professional voice answered on the other end. "House Subcommittee on Aviation. How may I direct your call?" Seraphina took a deep breath. "My name is Seraphina Washington." She began, her voice clearer and stronger than she thought possible. "I'm a US citizen at JFK Airport, and I need to report a severe case of misconduct by a TSA officer that has resulted in the destruction of my legal travel documents." She had made her second move. Now she just had to pray it would lead somewhere. Miles away in a quiet, book-lined office in Washington, D.C., a man named Marcus Thorne was having a very different kind of morning. As the chief investigator for the Aviation Subcommittee, Thorne was the man who dealt with the fallout when things went wrong in the skies and on the ground. He was a former federal prosecutor, a sharp, meticulous man in his early 50s, with a reputation for being unshakable and utterly incorruptible. He'd seen it all: safety violations, airline monopolies, and endless complaints about lost luggage and long lines. His junior aide, a bright, earnest young man named Ben, knocked on his door. "Mr. Thorne, I have a strange call on the main line. I wasn't sure where to route it." Thorne looked up from a dense report on runway incursions. "What is it, Ben?" "It's a young woman, a teenager, I think. Says she's at JFK, and a TSA officer just tore up her visa to the UK. Says he accused it of being fraudulent and ripped it in half." Thorne raised an eyebrow. "Ripped it in half, physically?" "That's what she claims, sir. She sounds very distressed, but also incredibly articulate. She's talking about constitutional rights and abuse of authority. Frankly, she doesn't sound like a crank." Thorne leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers forming a steeple. He received dozens of calls a week from disgruntled travelers. Most were complaints about rudeness or lost property. But this was different. The physical destruction of a legal document by a federal officer was a serious allegation. It crossed a line from poor customer service into a potential violation of federal law and civil rights. "What's the officer's name?" Thorne asked. "She identified him as Officer R. Miller," Ben replied, reading from his notes. Thorne's expression didn't change, but a flicker of recognition registered in his mind. The name wasn't unfamiliar. He had a memory like a steel trap, and the name Miller from the JFK sector had come up before. There had been other complaints, accusations of profiling verbal aggression, but they had always been he said, she said situations impossible to substantiate, and had been handled internally by the TSA. "And the young woman's name, Seraphina Washington, sir." Thorne looked out the window at the distant Capitol dome. The system was designed to handle complaints like this through official, slow-moving channels. A formal complaint would be filed, sent to the TSA, investigated by the very people who might want to cover it up, and months later a form letter would be issued. But Thorne hadn't gotten to his position by always following the standard playbook. His job was oversight, and sometimes oversight required a more direct approach. A teenager with the presence of mind to call a congressional subcommittee from the floor of an airport terminal was not your average complainant. "Ben," he said, his voice decisive, "patch her through to my direct line, and get me the direct number for the TSA head of federal security at JFK. Don't go through the public affairs office. I want the man in charge of the entire airport security operation, now." Ben's eyes widened slightly, the chief investigator himself taking a call from a teenager at an airport. This was not standard procedure. "Yes, sir," he said, hurrying out of the office. Thorne swiveled his chair to face his computer. As he waited for the call, he typed TSA Officer R. Miller, JFK, into a secure internal database. The file that appeared on his screen was thicker than he expected. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. This was more than just one bad apple. This was a potential rot in the barrel. He clicked open the first file. His face, usually a mask of professional neutrality, hardened into a grim, determined line. The karma, he thought, was long overdue. The phone on Marcus Thorne's desk chirped a polite, unassuming sound that belied the gravity of the call it announced. He clicked the speakerphone button, his eyes still scanning the digital file of Officer R. Miller. The list of informal complaints was damning, few in the last 2 years, all from minority travelers, all alleging unwarranted aggression and baseless accusations. Each had been dismissed due to lack of evidence. This is Marcus Thorne. Mr. Thorne. My name is Seraphina Washington. Her voice came through the speaker clear and steady, though he could detect the tremor of barely suppressed emotion beneath it. Thank you for taking my call. Ms. Washington, my assistant briefed me on your situation. You're at JFK, and you're alleging a TSA officer destroyed your visa. Alleging. The word was sharp, a sliver of indignation. No, sir. I'm stating a fact. Officer R. Miller tore my United Kingdom student visa in half approximately 30 minutes ago in the Terminal 4 security checkpoint. I have the 2 pieces in my hand. Thorne was impressed by her precision. No hysterics, just facts. And why did he claim to do this? He said the font on my last name looked too bold. He said it didn't look right to him. He implied it was fraudulent, and that people like me often use fake documents. People like you, Thorne, prompted already knowing the answer. There was a brief pause. I am a black 17-year-old Mr. Thorne. Thorne's jaw tightened. It was exactly as he suspected. Miller wasn't just an officer with a bad attitude. He was a liability with a badge using the color of his authority to enforce his own bigotry. Ms. Washington, are there any witnesses? Yes, sir. A professor from Columbia University, David Chen. He was behind me in line. I have his business card. I also took a photograph of the torn visa and a photograph of Officer Miller from a distance. His name tag is visible. Thorne leaned forward, a slow, grim smile touching his lips. This girl was extraordinary. In the midst of a crisis that would have sent most adults into a tailspin, she had calmly and methodically built a case. She had gathered evidence and secured a credible witness. You've done very well, Seraphina, he said, his voice softening slightly. I want you to stay exactly where you are. Don't talk to any other TSA personnel. Can you do that for me? Yes, sir. But my flight, it's boarding in less than an hour. My audition. We'll get to that. Thorne said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. First things first, I'm going to make a call. Stay on this line with my assistant, Ben. I'm going to put you on hold. He muted his end of the call and immediately dialed the number Ben had just handed him. It was the mobile phone of Daniel Morrison, the Federal Security Director for JFK, the highest-ranking TSA official at the entire airport. Morrison was a career bureaucrat, a man Thorne knew by reputation as someone more interested in smooth operations and avoiding bad press than in digging for uncomfortable truths. Morrison answered on the second ring, his voice professionally cheerful. Dan Morrison. Mr. Morrison, this is Marcus Thorne with the House Aviation Subcommittee. The cheerfulness in Morrison's voice evaporated, replaced by a guarded, formal tone. Mr. Thorne, to what do I owe the pleasure I'm calling about an incident at your Terminal 4 checkpoint that's happening as we speak? I'm currently on the other line with a 17-year-old musician named Seraphina Washington. She is claiming one of your officers, an R. Miller, just publicly accused her of carrying a fraudulent UK visa and then proceeded to physically tear it in half. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. He tore it in half, Mr. Morrison. Those are the facts as they've been presented to me by a very credible-sounding young woman who, I might add, has already secured a witness and photographic evidence. Thorne let the implications of that sink in. She is, as you can imagine, quite distressed. She's about to miss a flight to London for a music scholarship audition. I have no words, Mr. Thorne. This is completely outside of all protocol. It's Morrison stammered, clearly blindsided. "It's a career-ending move, Mr. Morrison, is what it is. And it's happening on your watch at your airport." Thorne said, his voice cold as steel. "Here is what's going to happen. You are going to personally go down to the Terminal 4 checkpoint. You are going to locate Ms. Washington. She's in the waiting area just past security. You are going to retrieve the 2 halves of her visa. You are going to escort her along with her belongings to the British Airways customer service desk. You will explain the situation to the supervisor and ensure she is booked on the next available flight to London at the TSA's expense. You will also arrange for ground transportation to her hotel upon her arrival." "Is that understood?" Morrison was flustered. "Yes, but the visa, it's torn. She can't travel on a damaged document. The airline won't accept it, and UK Border Force will send her right back." "That is your next problem to solve." Thorne countered. "You are going to get the British consulate on the phone, the emergency after-hours line. You are going to explain that a United States federal officer wrongfully destroyed a legally issued visa. You are going to use the full weight of your position to get an immediate emergency authorization for her travel. A letter of entry, a direct communication to immigration at Heathrow. Whatever it takes. You will not fail at this. Mr. Thorne, that could take hours if it's possible at all. You have about 45 minutes before the trail goes cold, and this becomes a multi-million-dollar lawsuit and a congressional hearing where you will be the star witness, explaining the culture of impunity you've allowed to fester at your airport." Thorne said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, each word laden with menace. "I have a file on Officer Miller that is thick with prior complaints of racial profiling. Complaints that were all handled internally and dismissed. This is the end of that road for him and for anyone who protected him. Solve this problem, Mr. Morrison. Now." He didn't wait for a reply. He hung up. He unmuted his line to Seraphina. "Seraphina, are you still there?" "Yes, Mr. Thorne. The Federal Security Director for JFK, a man named Daniel Morrison, is on his way to see you personally. He should be there within minutes. He will have instructions to rectify this situation. I want you to give him your full cooperation, but I also want you to call me back the moment you are on a plane, or the moment you feel you are not being treated with the utmost seriousness." Seraphina was speechless. The speed, the authority, the sudden reversal of her fortune was dizzying. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll play your heart out at that audition," Thorne said, "and call me when it's over." Back at the checkpoint, Officer Miller was enjoying the small surge of adrenaline that came from a confrontation. He felt important, a guardian against the forces of disorder. He was telling a story to a younger colleague about the time he'd caught a guy trying to smuggle rare lizards in his pants, embellishing the details for effect, when a panicked voice cut through the air. "Miller. Where's Miller?" It was his direct supervisor, a harried-looking man named Clark. Clark was pale and sweating. "Right here, boss." "What's the commotion?" Miller asked, puffing out his chest slightly. "The girl, the one with the violin. Where is she?" "What did you do?" Clark demanded, his eyes wide with fear. "I confiscated a fraudulent visa and told her she wasn't flying. Standard procedure for suspect documents," Miller said defensively. "It was a bad fake. You did what Clark looked like he was going to be sick." "Did you tear it?" "I rendered it unusable as per my training in document security," Miller said, using the jargon he thought made him sound professional. Clark's face contorted in a mask of pure terror. "You idiot! You absolute moron! That wasn't some random girl. She's on the phone with the House Aviation Subcommittee in D.C. The FSD himself is on his way down here. He's on the warpath. The color drained from Miller's face. The House Subcommittee. That was Congressional level. That was impossible. He'd been a TSA officer for 15 years. He'd had complaints, sure, but they always went away. They were always handled by the Union, by internal affairs. They never went up. Not like this. Just then a wave of motion parted the crowd of travelers. A tall man in a crisp suit, his face a thundercloud of fury, strode towards them. It was Daniel Morrison, the FSD. Miller had only ever seen him in training videos and from a distance at all-hands meetings. He was flanked by 2 airport police officers. Morrison's eyes, cold and filled with a terrifying rage, locked onto Miller. He didn't speak to him. He didn't even acknowledge his existence. He walked straight past him, his gaze fixed on the cowering supervisor. "Clark, where is the passenger?" Morrison's voice was a low growl that promised retribution. She's over there, sir." In the waiting area, Clark stammered, pointing a trembling finger. Morrison turned and strode towards Seraphina, who stood up as she saw the entourage approaching. His entire demeanor changed in an instant. The fury vanished, replaced by a mask of deep concern and profound apology. "Ms. Washington," he said, his voice smooth and solicitous. "I am Daniel Morrison, the Federal Security Director for this airport. I want to offer my most sincere and humble apologies for the utterly unacceptable and unprofessional treatment you have received today. What happened to you is a disgrace to this administration and to the country we serve." He held out his hand. "If you would please come with me. We are going to get this sorted out." Seraphina, stunned but resolute, looked from Morrison's outstretched hand to Officer Miller, who was now standing frozen, a look of dawning horror on his face. He was beginning to understand that his little kingdom, built on a foundation of petty tyranny and prejudice, was crumbling to dust around him. And Seraphina, the girl whose future he had tried to tear in two, was the one holding the dynamite. She placed her hand in Morrison's and let him lead her away, leaving Miller to face the consequences of his actions, which were just beginning to unfold. The transition was so abrupt, it felt like a hallucination. One moment, Seraphina was a suspect, a problem, an obstacle in the dehumanizing flow of the security line. The next, she was an honored guest, ushered through a discreetly marked door into a world of polished wood, supple leather, and profound, unnerving silence. This was the VIP lounge, a sanctuary she never knew existed, and its quiet luxury felt more accusatory than the open hostility of the checkpoint. Daniel Morrison, the Federal Security Director for all of JFK, personally escorted her to a plush armchair that swallowed her small frame. The man who commanded thousands of employees, whose authority was absolute within the airport's vast domain, now fussed over her like an anxious butler. Water, still or sparkling? Perhaps a juice? He asked, his voice a strained symphony of solicitation. His hands, which she noticed were large and manicured, trembled almost imperceptibly as he opened a bottle of Fiji water for her. "I'm fine, Seraphina," said her own voice, sounding hollow in the opulent quiet. She placed the two halves of her visa on the gleaming mahogany table between them. They looked like battlefield relics, obscene and out of place amidst the crystal glasses and silver bowls of nuts she had no intention of eating. Morrison's eyes flickered towards the torn document, and then quickly away, as if looking at it was physically painful. Ms. Washington, I want to reiterate. He began sitting opposite her on the edge of a matching chair, leaning forward in a posture of contrived earnestness that on behalf of the entire Transportation Security Administration, I am profoundly, deeply sorry. What occurred out there was not a mistake. It was a failure of training, a failure of supervision, and a failure of basic human decency that is frankly beyond my comprehension. Seraphina watched him, her mind a cold, clear instrument of observation. She could see the panic behind the well-rehearsed apology. This wasn't about her shattered dream. It was about the bomb that had gone off in his career. A bomb she had unintentionally armed and detonated with a single phone call. This frantic five-star hospitality was not for her, Seraphina Washington, the musician. It was for the incident, the complainant, the potential lawsuit, the career-ending Congressional inquiry. She was no longer a person to him, but a crisis to be managed. The officer involved, Ronald Miller, has been removed from his post. Morrison continued his words precise and clipped. He and his direct supervisor, a Mr. Clark, have been placed on immediate administrative leave. A full investigation, which I will personally oversee, has already been launched. I assure you the consequences will be severe. She nodded a small, almost imperceptible gesture. The words flowed over her, meaningless. Firing Miller wouldn't unrip the visa. It wouldn't erase the humiliation. It wouldn't give her back the hours she was now losing, precious hours of rest and preparation, before the most important performance of her life. My audition, she said, her voice cutting through his placating speech with the clean precision of a violin string. It's at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, in London. That's 5 a.m. New York time. My flight, the one I've now missed, was scheduled to land at Heathrow at 9 p.m. tonight. I was supposed to have time to sleep in a real bed, to acclimate, to warm up properly. The color drained from Morrison's already pale face. The practical, time-sensitive reality of her predicament crashed into his bureaucratic damage control. The problem wasn't just a matter of restitution. It was a race against the clock. Right. Of course. The audition, he stammered, scrambling for his phone. He turned away from her, his voice dropping to a low, furious growl. Get me an update from British Airways. Now I need the first available seat to London. I don't care what class. I don't care what it costs. If there isn't one, I want you to call every other airline that flies to Heathrow, Gatwick, even Luton. Find me a seat. Solve this. While Morrison paced the length of the lounge, a caged animal in a bespoke suit, Seraphina closed her eyes. She tried to transport herself away from the sterile luxury and the director's panicked energy. She tried to find the music. She pictured the sheet music for Bach's Sonata No. 1 in G minor, seeing the notes arranged on the staff in her mind's eye. Adagio. Slow, mournful, majestic. She tried to feel the familiar weight of the Galliano under her chin, the smooth, worn wood, a second skin. But the notes scattered, drowned out by the memory of Miller's sneer and the sickening sound of tearing paper. The anger was a roaring fire, and it was threatening to burn her talent to ash. An hour, a century passed. Morrison, looking haggard but triumphant, finally returned. Okay, we have a plan. It's unconventional, but it's the only way. He laid out the impossible itinerary, like a general briefing his troops for a desperate mission. There was one seat left on an Air France flight to Paris, leaving in just under 2 hours. It was in La Première, first class. From Charles de Gaulle, a private car service was already being dispatched to meet her on the tarmac. It would race her across Paris to the Gare du Nord. From there, she had a booking on the first Eurostar train of the morning to London St. Pancras again in their premier business class. Another car would be waiting at St. Pancras to take her directly to the Royal Academy of Music on Marylebone Road. There will be no margin for error. Morrison said, the gravity of the logistics weighing on him. According to our calculations, you will arrive at the Academy approximately 1 hour before your audition is scheduled to begin. There will be no time for your hotel. You will have to go straight there. He slid a thick, crisp envelope across the table. It felt heavy in her trembling hands. This contains all your new tickets and confirmations. It also contains $1,000 in cash for any and all expenses you might incur. Food, anything. It's yours. He took a deep breath. The most critical piece is this, he said, pulling out a separate letter-headed document. I have spoken personally with the duty officer at the British consulate. He was displeased, to say the least. This is a formal letter from my office co-signed by the consulate explaining the situation and offering a formal apology from the United States government. It includes an official waiver of entry overriding your damaged visa for this one-time exigent circumstance. They have transmitted a copy to the UK Border Force Command at St. Pancras. The officer on duty will be expecting you. You are to present this letter with your passport. Seraphina looked at the letter. It was a document born of pure power and panic, a diplomatic miracle achieved because a man in a position of authority was terrified of a man in a position of even greater authority. She was merely the catalyst. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice flat. There were no other words. She stood, the heavy envelope in one hand, her violin case in the other. Ms. Washington, Morrison said, his voice almost a plea. I hope you have a wonderful audition." She looked at him, at this powerful man made small by his own negligence. She offered him nothing, no smile, no absolution. She simply turned and walked towards the door, an airline representative already waiting to escort her. She didn't look back. The journey was a fever dream. She was swept through the airport in a cocoon of privilege, bypassing lines and protocols. On the Air France flight, she was sealed in a private first-class suite, a space larger than her bedroom back home. The flight attendant offered her champagne foie gras, a cashmere blanket. Seraphina just asked for water and silence. She stared out the window as the plane climbed over the dark expanse of the Atlantic, the lights of Long Island shrinking to a distant glitter. She felt a profound and terrible loneliness. She was a 17-year-old girl, hurtling through the night sky towards a dream that now felt like a trial fueled by the guilt and fear of powerful men. She couldn't sleep. Adrenaline and exhaustion warred within her, creating a nauseous state of hyper-awareness. She spent the 7-hour flight in a state of intense, silent practice. She didn't move her fingers. It was all in her mind. She deconstructed every bar of her chosen pieces. The Bach was no longer just a beautiful adagio. It was the cold dread that had washed over her at the checkpoint. The furious allegro of Vivaldi's Summer was the hot white rage she felt when the visa was torn. The dizzying, technically brutal Paganini Caprice number 24 was her response, a declaration of skill, a defiant scream that she could not, would not be broken. Landing in Paris at the break of dawn was a seamless blur. A man holding a sign with her name met her at the door of the plane. He whisked her to a black Mercedes waiting on the tarmac, its engine humming. Her passport was stamped in the car. As they sped through the waking city, the Eiffel Tower a distant silhouette against a pink and grey sky. The driver, a kind-faced man, who seemed to understand the urgency, simply said, "Bonne chance, mademoiselle." "Good luck." The Eurostar at Gare du Nord was a sleek, modern beast. She found her seat in the quiet business cabin and collapsed into it. As the train slid out of Paris and picked up speed, blurring the French countryside into a watercolor of greens and browns, the reality of the timeline began to crush her. Every minute was a grain of sand in an hourglass that was almost empty. The train plunged into the blackness of the Channel Tunnel, and for 20 minutes there was nothing but darkness and the rhythmic hum of the train. In the reflection of the window, she saw a pale, exhausted stranger with her face. They emerged into the daylight of Kent, England. She was in the right country. But she wasn't there yet. At London St. Pancras, the final hurdle awaited. The UK Border Force station was crowded and intimidating. She took her place in line, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. When her turn came, she approached the booth, her hands slick with nervous sweat. She presented her passport, the torn visa, and the letter from Morrison to the officer, a stern-faced woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense bun. The officer read the letter slowly, her expression unreadable. She then looked at the 2 pieces of Seraphina's visa, holding them up as if to confirm they were once a single entity. Finally, her gaze settled on Seraphina. It was a long, appraising look that took in the expensive violin case, the dark circles under her eyes, and the sheer, vibrating tension in her posture. So the Yanks tore up your visa because they didn't like the font, and now they've put you through all this to say, "Sorry." The officer summarized her voice, a masterpiece of dry understatement. "Something like that," Seraphina whispered. A corner of the officer's mouth twitched the barest hint of a smile. She took out her stamp, positioning it over a clean page in Seraphina's passport. "Some people will do anything for a bit of drama, won't they?" She brought the stamp down with a satisfying, percussive thud. "Welcome to the United Kingdom, Ms. Washington. Try not to let our lot break anything of yours." She winked. "Now go on. You look like you're in a hurry. Knock 'em dead." That small, unexpected moment of human connection, of solidarity, was like a splash of cold water. It shocked her back to life. Another car was waiting. As it sped through the chaotic morning traffic of London, Seraphina performed her final act of preparation. In the cramped space of the back seat, she peeled off her travel-worn clothes and slipped into the simple, elegant black performance dress she had packed. She ran a brush through her braids and took a single, deep, centering breath. She arrived at the grand, imposing entrance of the Royal Academy of Music with only 12 minutes to spare. She walked through its hallowed, echoing halls, the scent of old wood floor polish and distant music filling her lungs. This was it, the place she had dreamed of for years. She felt a strange calm descend. The chaos was outside these walls. The anger, the fear, the exhaustion, it was fuel now. A monitor led her to a small practice room. "You have 10 minutes, he said, his tone neutral. She opened the Galliano's case. The violin felt cool and familiar in her hands. She had no time for a proper warm-up, no time to ease her cold, stiff fingers into action. She played a few frantic, desperate scales, the notes sounding thin and shaky. It was useless. The music wasn't in her fingers yet. It was still trapped in her heart. Miss Washington, the monitor's head, appeared at the door. "They're ready for you." She walked out of the room and towards the stage of the audition hall. It was smaller than she had imagined, but the silence within it was vast and absolute. The polished floor gleamed under the focused glare of the stage lights, creating a lonely island of light in a sea of shadows. In those shadows, behind a simple table, sat 3 figures. They were indistinct, faceless arbiters of her fate. "Miss Seraphina Washington," a voice asked, crisp, clear, and very British. "Yes," she replied. Her own voice sounded impossibly small. "You may begin when you are ready." She stepped into the center of the light. She took a breath, and another. She closed her eyes, shutting out everything. Morrison's panicked face, Miller's cruel sneer, the blur of the journey, the terror, the rage. She let it all fall away. She thought of her mother, working a double shift to pay for her last set of strings. She thought of the Gagliano in her hands, an instrument that had survived for 3 centuries, holding the music of generations in its wood. She thought of the UK border officer's wink. "Knock 'em dead." She raised her bow. Silence. Then she played. The first notes of the Bach Adagio were not gentle or melancholic. They were raw, infused with a profound and weary sorrow. Each note was a tear she hadn't been able to shed. But as the movement progressed, a steely strength emerged, a thread of resilience weaving through the grief. She didn't pause before launching into Vivaldi's Summer. The performance was not a rendition. It was an immolation. It was the furious, brilliant storm of her last 24 hours, unleashed as a tempest of notes. The violin shrieked and roared, her bow arm a blur of controlled violence. This was the argument at the checkpoint, the tearing of the paper, the frantic race across continents, a brilliant, breathtaking tantrum of virtuosity. And then the Paganini, the Caprice, number 24. A piece so notoriously difficult, it's often used simply as a showpiece for technical fireworks. For Seraphina, it became something else. It was a declaration of war. Each variation was a parry and a thrust. The arpeggios were a defiant laugh. The left-hand pizzicato was a taunt. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was wielding them, proving with every impossible feat of dexterity that this was who she was. "You can tear my visa, you can try to ground me, but you cannot touch this. This is mine." When the final triumphant note faded into the vast silence of the hall, Seraphina stood perfectly still, her chest heaving, sweat and tears mingling on her cheeks. The bow hung from her limp fingers. She had nothing left. She had poured every ounce of her pain, her anger, and her soul into the Galliano, and left it all on the stage. For a long moment, there was no sound from the shadows. She could see the figures leaning towards each other, whispering. Then the central figure leaned forward into the spill of the light. He was a man she recognized instantly from the cover of the Strad magazine, one of the world's most celebrated violinists. He looked at her, not as a judge examines a student, but as a witness to some inexplicable event. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated awe. "Miss Washington," he said, his voice hushed as if he were afraid to break the spell. "I have been judging auditions in this hall for 20 years. I have heard prodigies, I have heard technicians, I have heard poets. I have never, ever—" He paused, searching for the words, heard anything quite like that. He leaned further forward, his eyes locking on hers. "Tell me," he asked, his voice soft with genuine, mystified curiosity. "What on earth has happened to you in the last 24 hours?" Seraphina's story is a powerful testament to the fact that one person's courage can indeed change the world, or at least a significant piece of it. It's a stark reminder that authority should never be mistaken for righteousness, and that systems of power are only as strong as the integrity of the people within them. Officer Miller, his supervisor, and Director Morrison, learned that hard lesson. Their careers ended not just because of one girl's complaint, but because of a systemic rot that she had the courage to expose. This wasn't just a story about a torn visa. It was about the tearing down of a culture of impunity. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of speaking truth to power, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas where karma doesn't just knock, it kicks the door down. Thank you for watching.